Right, welcome to the latest episode of the Red Pilled Fiction Factory. Last week I had the first playwright the show has hosted as a guest, and very strange coincidence, wasn't planned at all, but this week we've got another playwright. His name is Jim Bonner, and his biography is very spare and dry, so we don't know much about him from the internet, other than that he was born in Texas in '95, which makes him very young by most of the guest standard. And he's done a few degrees in history and political science, but beyond that, there isn't much to know from what I can determine, and I'm looking forward to changing that today. Jim, hi, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you and your background.
Hi, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity. Um, my background, I like it says in the short biography that's in the back of the book. I grew up in Texas. I've born, raised in Texas. I've lived here my entire life, and I grew up on a small farm ranch sort of environment. It was about 10 acres out in the middle of nowhere, and my dad had some goats and we had some chickens and everything. So it was a very rural environment. I was homeschooled on that environment, and that I think that is probably one of the biggest factors for my own personal development in terms of my values or who I consider myself. But I went to college, met my now wife there at college, and I was going to study history and political science because that's just my interests. I wasn't even really thinking about job opportunities, and everyone had always joked that if you have those degrees, you're right after you get into college, you might as well just step into the unemployment line because there's absolutely no future for those fields other than teaching it,
Yeah,
or maybe like working for a political campaign or something like that. But I didn't really have any plans. I wanted to teach it, but after going through college, I decided that prospect was not my cup of tea, and I did not want to teach at a university or a high school or anywhere. So I started working at whatever job would take me. I worked in retail. I was a nighttime shelf stalker, became a daytime shelf stalker, worked at a warehouse, worked at night, and then girlfriend at the time, wife now, and I moved to a different city, worked at lawn care company. I was the weed whacker guy. And then I worked for a different warehouse, and that one actually stuck. And I slowly went from picking up the trash in the warehouse to picking product to being the team lead for one of the areas of the warehouse. And then I caught the sight of some of the managers there, and they moved me into the logistical side of things to where now I'm plotting where um, our route drivers go every day and determining that through um, statistical analysis. So it's a lot of different backgrounds. I can't say I really have one particular background. I've feels like I've done a lot of things so far anyway. But,
it, okay. Where does the book, sorry, the play you've written has a very firm foundation in the classics. Both ancient Greece and Rome come into it in their own way. And we'll come on to this a bit more, but you display a remarkable grip of the history and everything, even down to costumes and stuff. Where do the classics come in? Was that part of your history degree, or did you pick it up on your own?
it was not part of the history degree. The history in college is basically just a rehashing of American high school history knowledge. It's very boring, and most of the classical knowledge that I have comes through my own interest in that subject. And I think that's where a lot of my homeschooling helped because through a co-op that my family was a part of with other homeschooling families. There was one person who was one of the parents was very into classical literature, and it really sparked my interest. And so I read everything that I could get my hands on. I read Thucydides, Herodotus, and then a lot of the different playwrights from that time, Aeschylus, Sophocles. My favorite is Aristophanes. And I read the Iliad and Odyssey, sure, but I also read the Aeneid, which was the Aeneid was basically the foundation for this play. Like, if I love that poem is, to me, it's almost superior to the Iliad. It's just a completely different animal, and a lot like my play. It's basically a fan fiction version of
Yeah.
ancient mythology. It's just, he was Virgil lived a little bit closer to the time than I do.
Well, I was super impressed, as I say, by all this when I read it, but now I'm even more impressed because, honestly, I thought you had maybe an uncle who was a classics scholar at Harvard or something, tipping you in the right direction all the time. But for someone from Texas, rural Texas at that, who's had other full-time jobs to keep him busy, to get so much knowledge together and harness it so well is remarkable. So well done. So whereabouts in this, you've had a short life by comparison, as I say to most, I guess. Somehow you squeezed in writing the play within all these other jobs you did and your college degree. When did the idea first come to you about putting pen to paper?
For this particular, for this thing, I had kind of always been ruminating on it. I mean, I'd been wanting to do something for a long time, probably in my teens, like 15 or 16. I wanted to write like an epic poem about Diomedes, who's one of the characters in this play. He's a big, yeah, I wouldn't say big. He's kind of like he's like a medium character in the Iliad, super strong dude. I wanted to kind of write an epic poem about him, like after the war, the Trojan War. But that's just not really my thing. I'm not very big on poetry, and I just kind of put it on a back burner. And so, about the time I graduated college, I finally had free time to do a lot of reading and writing, which I had wanted to do, but which academic studies had prevented me from doing the kind that I wanted to. And it was around that time that I started thinking about, okay, well, how can I make this Diomedes poem idea something that I can actually do? And the easiest way to me was to make it a play. I don't actually know where that idea came from. It just always seemed like that was going to be the easiest, and yeah, the easiest way to do it. It never even crossed my mind to do it as like a normal book with like descriptions and prose. It was always going to be a play.
Well, it's set in a classical background and the context, but it's also very classical in the way you've executed it. I honestly could have, I'm sure you could fool people taking extracts from it and they would question whether it was Shakespeare written it or some other person of that ilk. It's really expertly executed in that sense, and very convincing, because obviously with plays you have the challenge of convincing the reader more so perhaps than in a book. So you started writing it. How long did it take you to complete?
Probably like, depending on when you want to like officially start the timetable, probably like 3 to 5 years. Just because I wasn't able to dedicate myself full time to doing it, so it was always in little bursts. It was never like one drawn out process.
Okay, and would you say that you were already? It is quite political. You have to pay great attention to pick out the politics. It's not overt and in your face in any sense, and it's very much in the tradition, I think, of the old classical plays and poems that you've referred to already. That they have a subtext that's definitely got political angles. You refer back to your farm youth, and that was being influential on you. Did did the red pill nature of your psychology come as you were writing it, or was it already predetermined by that stage and you were ready to express these ideas through that was why you were setting out to write the play in the first place?
It actually they kind of occurred parallel to one another, because I had always had like a conservative upbringing, kind of like, and especially when I was growing up during the early 2000s when the Iraq War was going on. I remember like freedom fries and freedom toast, because no one wanted to respect France at that point in time. It was a very fun time to be a kid in America, especially because I was in Boy Scouts as well. My scoutmaster was in the National Guard, and so he was very big on like American supremacy and that sort of stuff. It's a really, really fun time to be alive. But I'd always been conservative, and in 2016, that changed a lot of things. But I was in college in 2016 when that happened, and I graduated the next year, and I was still pretty conservative. I didn't have any radical views or any sort of different views from the mainstream, I should say. But it was actually once I got into the workforce and I started working around other different people that I realized that there are differences. There's deep differences between different peoples, and there's deep real truths about a lot of what our ancestors had laid down in terms of those differences. And so I started reading a bunch of different literature about it while I was working at these warehouses. Like my third day on the job in one of these warehouses, there were these two dudes. One of them was a manager, and one of them was an employee. And the manager came up to the employee and it was like, "Got a bullet with your name on it. Don't mess with me." And I was like, "What is going on here?" Like, I've never been around anything like that. It's not only racial differences, but just cultural differences in the city too. So it was a big culture shock. And it was about that time that I had been writing the play as well. So I started looking into things a little bit deeper, and both of the ideas kind of merged into one another. I would say around 2018, 2019 timeframe.
That's interesting. I also underwent a similar experience with the writing process. I thought I had all the politics that I wanted set out in my brain before I started writing. Almost had the notes, I had it all planned and coordinated. But the writing process itself is a weird thing, and stuff comes up that you'd never thought of before literally as you're typing it out. And yeah.
I'm sorry, I did not mean to interrupt.
No, I was just going to say, for those who are maybe thinking of putting pen to paper from a red pill perspective, you don't have to, if I was to give some advice, it would be you don't have to have it all laid out in front of you like a map, because first of all, it becomes a bit too rigid and dogmatic if you do it that way, but also there's so much that will come to you in the process itself. Have confidence in just going through the procedure, and you will find magic appears in front of you almost against your better judgment sometimes. Yes.
Yeah, I found that very true. I found myself becoming more aware of what was happening around me. Anytime I start like any sort of story or draft of anything, I just become more aware of what's going on around me, because I guess I'm just looking for data for it.
Yes, your brain starts working different ways. You wake up in the middle of the night almost screaming because you've suddenly made a connection that for decades has avoided you. And it's only because you're actually doing the hard grafting at last instead of just leaving it for another day. So don't let anyone put you off if you're in a similar position out there. Now we're going to come to the play itself. I don't think I've mentioned the name. It's Interbellum, which is Latin for between wars, which will become, the reason for that will become evident if I've interpreted it right. I suppose I understand that one page of screenplay is worth about a minute on stage. So I'm guessing it would turn into about an hour and a half if you were to produce it. As I say, it's very much classical style. You'd think it was written by one of the greats from the past. But the tragedy is it hasn't been produced yet, you tell me. Is that correct?
That is correct. And to be honest, just as much as it was always going to be a play to me, I always assumed it was never going to be produced. It was kind of like that was just a fact that was going to happen. And with that acceptance, like, okay, well, it's never going to be produced. I can just make this like whatever I want. I don't have to be thinking about, okay, I have to do this between two actors, or I have to think about the budget of the director. No, I just told the story.
Well, that's an asset. I think that's a very good aspect that you've addressed there. But all the same, it is a tragedy, and hopefully with things like this interview, maybe more people out there will become aware of it, and a production one day will be in the making. I've made a couple of notes, some of which are from your description of the play, I think, coupled with a couple of comments I came across. So I'll just give people some more context about the play. It comes across as an extremely accomplished, well-researched and professional piece of work with a deep understanding of the subject matter that's rare to see these days. And I might add, especially in someone so young. It is set in the storied western coast of ancient Italy, 30 years after the Trojan War and before the birth of the Roman Empire, the creation of which the events in the play foreshadow. Let's address that for a moment. Lavinium is the setting. Lavinia was Aeneas's wife. He had fought in the Trojan Wars, and one of his arch enemies in that war had been Diomedes. And Diomedes reappears to sort of resume battle in some respects, intellectual battle as much as physical, 30 years after the Trojan War. But Lavinium, I also learned from my research the last few days, is the supposed setting where Romulus and Remus were born. So not only are we dealing with the end of the Trojan Empire as such, the sort of consequences, long-term consequences of that, but we're also seeing in the same setting and scenes the birth, if you like, longer term of the Roman Empire that would follow. Is that where the name Interbellum comes from? And is that the context? Am I right in this assessment?
In a lot of ways, yes. And I'm with a lot of this book, there's at least two ways to interpret what's going on. So even the title is like that. So interbellum either means between the wars, or it's like the war between. So
okay.
So Troy and Rome, this is something that was vital to happen between the destruction of one and the founding of another, but it's also between the destruction of Troy and the destruction of Rome, and it's between different wars, and it's also a war between different cultures and civilizations.
Yes, the play does address the cycles of life, if you like, and definitely the cycles of civilization. Aeneas, in one scene, I'm going to give an excerpt. He's talking to his dead wife, and he says, "I saw it all, from virtue to decadence, from survival to sacrifice, and the cycles drawn within our blood. Wretched weapons, wars without glory, lost loyalties and dimming hope. Perhaps I've forgotten the mission. Perhaps we have become complacent, just as the Danaan Odysseus returned from lethargy and witnessed the apathy of his absence. So too is the spirit of our people's kinetic vein, not a stagnant birthright to abuse. Those of the vision, I remember, for the wrongs remained unaware of the fluctuating paths they walked, all talking for personal acclaim. They never saw themselves linked chain to chain with the link that bleeds through the pages, nor the steps behind and ahead. Their brutal aggression from weakness, their honesty from ignorance, their inadequacy from immaturity." So there you're addressing, as I say, the cycles, and We're in the weak men create hard times stage, more or less, he's talking about, isn't it? Or we're in the lull between vigorous, healthy societies. Am I right there?
Yes, absolutely. And even more so, he's realizing that he is one of those who is responsible for that.
Right. Okay. Yes. Aeneas was a defender of Troy, and his main rival in the play is this character Diomedes. Now, I want to address him a little bit because it helps, obviously, in these type of works to understand the context and who's who. They've all got their own massive history. In fact, if you look up Diomedes, as Wikipedia goes on forever about him from all sorts of different angles. But I love the way he's portrayed, even from the opening, where he's described as an old, worn veteran of the Trojan War, draped head to toe in rags, looking like a wild beast or a prehistoric man out of time. It's great stuff, and it's very red-pilled stuff. My own introduction of my hero is almost identical to that, but it's a bit more drawn out. So tell us, and also my interest has been piqued because on Twitter, as absurd as this sounds, I follow a guy called Diomedes Respecter, and he's always got great comments. And he obviously holds Diomedes in high regard. And I've actually asked him to explain his name handle to me, but he hasn't done so. I didn't give him much time, mind you, before this interview. But Diomedes is obviously some guy out there that I've sadly bypassed all my life. And can you give me a bit more about him and a bit more meat on the bone?
Sure, yeah. So in the Iliad, Diomedes, he has a whole chapter dedicated to him about how he basically goes toe to toe with Ares, the god of war, and he even like jumps on Ares' chariot and is like walking between the horses on the spoke of the chariot, just about to like hurt Ares, and he winds up hurting Aphrodite in the process, if I remember right, and like slashing her like on her hand or on her cheek or something like that. And he's just like the most like badass character in the whole book, in my opinion, because he doesn't really deal with the same sort of moral questions a lot of the other characters in the Iliad do. He seems to be like always correct, always attacking. He's there to win the war. He's not getting caught up in all the drama. And if you look at some of the myths after the Trojan War, Diomedes' wife winds up betraying him while he was out at war because he had attacked Aphrodite, and so in revenge, she has Diomedes' wife seduced by a suitor, and they basically lay this trap for Diomedes, and Diomedes barely escapes, but he has to leave his home because of that, impiety that he committed during the Trojan War by attacking a goddess.
Right.
So he's a really interesting character, but I never see him talked about very much, except in the context of the respecters out there.
Yeah, I have to say, I thought it was just a fictional character when I first saw the name. I hadn't heard of him at all, but he is quite a fascinating one. And I think your description sums it up much better than Wikipedia does. The baddest ass character in the book, and that's a trait that continues through your work. I have him here speaking about an extract on War and Peace, and he's talking. This is a theme that's come back a lot, not the War and Peace so much as what I call the cultured thug, which is we need men who are, as Colonel Kurtz put it, I think, civilized and yet able to be brutal. He had better, Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, or Conrad's version, depending on which you prefer. But Diomedes plays that role here. Is they're civilized men. Their intentions are for the best, but the methodology can sometimes be called into question, because without resorting to pretty much war crime type events, that they don't feel they can see their goal be reached. Anyway, this is Diomedes on the subject. I've been called an animal and a machine of war, but I see no difference in these compliments. Men are creatures of conflict. We are an omnivorous predator. Instead of sharp teeth or bird's eyes, we were given intelligence, and we squander our instinct away when not warring. There's no way to avoid it either, for war will come again as sure as dawn from the horizon and the snows in white cycle. One nation will never say to another, lo, disband your forces for good, and we too shall ours. The impracticality is overbearing. For what happens when some force, external or within, seizes the opportunity and lays low the foundations of both? I may not like my role or the war itself, but conflict is eternal, and war the highest conflict, and our species the only one capable of it. Therefore, it is the pinnacle of our nature, its unavoidable epitome, the highest our people can achieve. A terrific writing.
It's funny because I had recently read Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, long after I wrote this book, and I'm like, as you're reading that, I'm like, oh my god, that sounds like something from Cormac McCarthy, and I had not realized that. I just only recently read that book.
Well, it is an eternal theme. I mean, as I say, others have done it in film, and from Coppola to Conrad. So I can see that would happen. To my shame, I haven't read any Cormac McCarthy, which I must get around to, because everyone here cites him on this channel. But yes,
I probably wouldn't have written that if I had read Blood Meridian, because I would have thought that I'd copying him too much.
No, don't you worry. This is what we need, is just different angles on the same topics and the same. We're only getting one side of it these days, which is the opposition's side. And the more of us that address the issues, the better the quality will become, and our understanding of these things will become. Now, would you give us a quick sort of summary of how the play unravels? Diomedes turns up in Aeneas's territory. Aeneas is still the king, effectively. Just give us a rough idea of how the play unravels.
So a lot of the play is incumbent on the context of the Trojan War, but in the play itself, I give that context, and I do have some endnotes that explain some of the more abstruse points. But after the Trojan War, after Aeneas, after his city Troy had been conquered by Diomedes and the Achaeans, the Greeks, Aeneas goes through his own odyssey of sorts in the Mediterranean, and he winds up in Italy, where he founds a city, and his family, or the remnants of it anyway, and his people, the remnants of it, start to intermingle with the native Latin people in Italy. And after 30 years of that, after they found some stability and the war was more or less a thing of the past, Diomedes comes wandering into their territory, and the guard approaches them, and through the encounter, it's realized that Diomedes has some sort of curse or some sort of taint to his character, where everyone who touches him or makes eye contact with him winds up hating him for no reason. And so they bring him to the palace in Lavinium, where Aeneas and his family are. And the central crux of the play is, what is Aeneas's family going to do with Diomedes? And is the war still affecting them? And does Diomedes even deserve to live? And those sort of questions. And it's more or less a lot of back and forth between Aeneas's family and between themselves and with Diomedes, and there's a court scene and trying to figure out this question. That's generally the layout of the play.
And it reaches a conclusion. Well, there's a lot of action throughout the play. It's worth stressing. It's not dry and boring in that sense at all. Plenty of activity and escapes and vicious deaths and all sorts. And then they come to a kind of, well, I don't want to spoil the ending, but a kind of truce towards the end, which I guess then leaves hanging the whole issue, what follows, not just in ancient times, but everything that's followed since then, because it's all based on really Rome and everything that your play segues into. Were there any writers who, apart from the ancients, Greeks and so on, who that you've mentioned, who influenced you along the way? Do you adhere to certain writers more so than others, or is it there's nobody particular that can be said to have influenced you?
To be honest, when I was writing this, I had a lot of this. When I started writing this, I had all the knowledge still of all that ancient stuff, but I wouldn't say that the style of any of the ancient authors, even Aristophanes or any of the playwrights, I wouldn't say that their style was affecting me at all when I wrote this. I was actually looking more at contemporary stuff, especially movies, whenever I was writing this, because it is basically, I mean, it's a script, it's just dialogue. It's a bunch of dialogue. So now there was one movie that I found really, really fascinating and that I kind of studied for a little bit while I was writing the play, and that was the Coriolanus movie that Ralph Fiennes made and starred in. That one was, to me, that was exceptional, and I wanted to try to capture a lot of that tone and a lot of the feeling of hopelessness or helplessness to what was going on. And along with that, though, I read, I think it was George Bernard Shaw. He wrote a play, not many people know about it, called Caesar in Egypt, or Caesar and Cleopatra, I think. I read it a long time ago. But there's a scene where Caesar's confronting the priests in Egypt, and that scene always stuck with me in terms of how you can write in a way where the audience knows who's in charge, even if the characters themselves don't seem to know. It's like the whole point of the scene was that Caesar's just completely owning these priests, and the priests don't realize it until it's way too late. And it's just the way that scene plays out with the dialogue was really, really hit home with me.
Very good. And my last excerpt from the book, you address the role of our role in society as writers, poets, you call them in the play, but you're really those of us who in the literary world, and sort of almost emphasizing our duty to our fellow men, those of us who've taken up this weird world lifestyle. And it reads, it's from Aeneas towards the end. I wished poets to make the flesh word, but now I read that the writing must be from the hands which once held yours. So he's talking about his own responsibilities. I rise above these passions, those passions now and forever, to do my duty to truth with an honest awareness, dissipating that which obscures your reflection. All now is written in light before the pen touches page, and I stare directly at the source of the script, igniting all indecision to burn in its warmth. Just as after the storm, the shadow of night is singed from the mountain rock, and all the snow pondering its trees begins to fall in clumps, obscuring tracks left by the creeping things, so too must I become the cosmic weapon of human nature to bring that light unto my people, to play my part in inaugurating the visions yet manifested. Visiting the court as a king, I will wield virtue, not wrath or weakness. He's talking as his role as king as well, but I got the impression you're talking about us as writers too. Is that how you'd say it? That's it. Excuse me.
I had honestly never. I think that's an amazing interpretation because I had never interpreted that to be writers, but now that you say it in that context, that makes a lot of sense. But it was more about the action. So to me, and I found this actually with like a few different writers or people who I've talked to who like writing is that especially like someone like Yukio Mishima, even though I didn't talk with them, I get the impression from like Sun and Steel that they disregard a lot of like the written word in a lot of ways because it's and this is for me too. I think that it's inferior to action, but I think that in most cases it's necessary to language in general or writing to communicate that it's necessary to um, instigate action or to direct it in the right direction.
Yes, it has. It's not the be all and end all by any means. Gosh, no. But it is almost the sine qua non. You need it before anything else. The condition, to get going, people need to understand what it's all about. Look, and probably this war or the COVID situation showed us the data out there is immense, especially that we all receive daily is unbelievable on an incredible scale compared to what our ancestors would have received. But it takes interpretation, and it needs to be interpreted in order that we can act properly. And unfortunately, there aren't that many people who are being honest about the way they interpret it. So the few of us that should. Oh, excuse me. I was at a bonfire yesterday and I'm still choking. Tell us about your next work, which is a book, I understand.
Yeah, my next book is nonfiction. It's nonfiction. So the title of the book is called Compendious Visions, and the subtitle is Discourses on Discourses on Contemporary Decline. And I don't really know how to describe it because every time I try to describe it, it just comes off as being very cringe and very unappealing sounding.
You can't leave us hanging there, I'm afraid. You have to tell us something else.
I'm trying to find the right words to express it, but it's more or less just a summation of what I consider to be knowledge that is necessary to come to our sphere of things, and after that, what sort of action is necessary in order to not only survive in our own individual lives, because I think things are going to get incredibly bad within our lifetimes, but it's also to thrive and try to mitigate that as much as possible, and perhaps on the other side of things to set ourselves up as the elite. Because right, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. You go.
I had written another nonfiction thing, and it was published by Firstness Journal, and it was about the second intermediate period of ancient Egyptian history. And I see our society going in a lot of the similar directions, which everyone makes parallels to Rome, which are accurate. But I see other historical periods as being more accurate. And I think that when central powers or central authorities like the federal government in the United States are unable to allocate resources or are unable to enforce their policies, which I see that happening in the future.
Already.
Then it's up to already. I mean, it's the infrastructure is not good, and the bureaucrats who they're using to enforce it are becoming more dysgenic and more dogmatic, leading them to be unable to act appropriately. But I see the federal or central power, whatever you want to call it, I see the federal government being unable to allocate resources properly, and so it will fall to local factions to basically pick up the slack, and in that minor power vacuum, they can start to assert themselves. And I see us fulfilling that niche and becoming more or less de facto um, leaders in our own localities.
Yes.
If it's not the entire United States, then it's a certain part of Texas, or there's little pockets here or there, and it's more or less like the way that the Middle Ages wound up.
This second period of the Egyptians, I didn't quite catch the exact term, but does that coincide with the Sea Peoples and the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, or are we talking a different?
It's funny because every time I bring it up, everyone says, "Is that the Sea Peoples?"
Right.
and they're not. It's about like 1,000 years before the Sea Peoples. Actually,
okay.
It's like way before that.
The Sea Peoples being apparently it was probably the only time in recorded history where all civilizations fell at the same time, and that's why it's become topical again, because it's really looking that way at the moment. It's not just going to be one civilization or society collapsing. It's maybe we're looking at the possibility that every civilization collapses simultaneously around the world. So give us a brief synopsis of the period you're talking to, 1,000 years before. Because it sounds like it's relevant and interesting to the current situation.
Well, it is. I don't actually talk about it at all in the book that I am going to publish in March, but the general themes to me are absolutely parallel. But so Egypt is ruled by a central bureaucracy that delegates responsibilities to local powers who are, it's a hierarchy from the top to the bottom, from the pharaoh to the local administrator. And over time, due to dynastic successions, due to famine, and most importantly, due to the immigration of what they came to be known as the Hyksos, people from modern day Palestine and Syria, into the Nile Delta. Due to their immigration, they slowly rose through the ranks of Egyptian society in the Nile Delta. And when the central power of the pharaoh waned and ultimately fractured, they were able to assert their own regional hegemony in the Nile Delta.
Right.
And they wound up sweeping through the rest of Egypt because the rest of Egypt was unprepared.
Collapsed, yeah, and unprepared. Yes. And they're coming in from the inside and not the outside, and from within the system. So that sounds fascinating in its own way. Maybe a play there for you one of these days. So going back to your book, that you're in the final stages of it. It's ready to go, more or less.
More or less. It will probably be mid to late March, although depending on how fast things develop, it could be sooner. But that's my timetable right now, and hoping everything goes smooth so I can just get it off my plate, because I've been working on it for way too long and I'm ready for it to be done.
Very good. And other fiction, or in terms of plays or novels, any chance of that?
I have worked on this idea that I had made with someone that we follow each other on Twitter, and that was with my first account before I deleted it. But we had workshopped this idea, and I wrote the first chapter to it, and I made the summary of the second chapter. But the idea is you have somewhat alternate history after World War I, diesel punk. So okay. Not steampunk, it's like steampunk, but not gay. And you have basically like the Freikorps that wound up arising in Germany during the 20s, 30s. You basically have those arising kind of all over the place. And the main characters would be this group of people like that, whose kind of thing is that they have airplanes. And they do airplane stuff around the Mediterranean, Africa, Europe, and there's espionage, and there's a lot of missions where they wind up into gunfights. And so the first chapter was published by, I'm drawing a blank actually right now. But anyway, the first chapter was published, and it's about a group of the main characters of this group infiltrating this very ritzy party at night on an Aegean island where they're having this gala, and they're trying to steal these new prototype airplanes that are going to be expoed the next day. So that's
All right.
that sort of thing would be what I would like to work on next if I get the time.
If you get the time. Well, you're young. I didn't start writing until I was about 30 odd. And you've already finished your first work in your 20s. So it's fantastic. And you've got the talent, there's no question. So hopefully you'll find the time. And we will be able to come back to watch your career. I'm sure it's going to be impressive. Develop. Hopefully, if there's anyone out there who can help see a production made of this wonderful work, they'll get in touch. And if not, I'm sure it will rise to the top at some point, because it deserves to and is well worthy of it.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Not at all, Jim. It's been a real pleasure. Congratulations. Keep going, and let's see what the future holds for you. It's going to be interesting. Thanks a lot for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. Hope you all have a great day.
Thank you. All the best.